The Every Bit Counts Challenge is a challenge every August put on by a creator here on YouTube, Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead. And every August she puts out this challenge to encourage us to put up something every single day, no matter how little or how big that project is. It's something that I've participated in ever since I've had a garden, basically, even prior to really being familiar with her page, her channel, or the challenge. So basically the concept is, if you do a little bit every single day, it will add up and you will have an awful lot put away by the end of the month. I work outside of the home, and so there are days where it's incredibly challenging to come home and in that couple-hour window being able to preserve something and put it up. So I will be honest, I am not incredibly diligent about putting something up every single day, but I can tell you that I definitely make up for it over the weekends. So today I have quite a bit different preservation projects that we're going to be working on. I don't have anything to can. I'm going to do that tomorrow. I have family coming for dinner later today, and I don't like doing big projects like that when I want to be able to focus on some other activity that might be occurring. So today we're going to be doing some dehydrating, we're going to be doing some freeze drying, and I'm going to be prepping my freezers to sort of roll out the very next batch, so to speak. So this way I have everything prepped and ready, and when my freeze dryer is complete with one batch, I can just throw another batch in. I love my freeze dryer. I just received it last year. I think it was just last year. No, I think it's almost been two years now. I think this November will be 2 years. So last harvest season was my first harvest season to use the freeze dryer. I'm still learning kind of what I prefer and don't prefer to have freeze dried. There are some things that I still enjoy putting in my dehydrator, which is behind me, and that is running, I feel like, constantly this time of year. So we'll kind of go through that a little bit, and I figured I would just bring you along to show you what I am preserving this time of the year and how I'm going to preserve it. This year I opted to let my freezers take some time off. Typically every harvest season I am doing all the things. I'm canning, I'm dehydrating, and I'm freezing. And then last year, of course, I incorporated the freeze dryer. With our family size kind of getting smaller, we aren't going through certain things as quickly as we used to in the past. One of those items is the meat that I have put up. So we get 2 hogs and a steer every single year. With the smaller family size, my beef freezer and my pork freezer, we're not eating out of that quite as quickly. On top of that, for several months, my husband's been basically only eating chicken. He's training for a show, and that's actually going to be coming to an end here this coming week, and he'll be back to eating, you know, whatever it is I prepare for dinner at that point. But he's a big consumer of the food here in our home as well, and when you have now basically it's just me and 1.5 people eating for dinner every day, we don't go through it as quickly. So I don't want to overburden my other freezer with a ton of produce, because I had already put in an order for the two hogs and steer to come again this November. I didn't foresee my family size changing so drastically at the time that I placed my order. So I might need to have some wiggle room over into some other freezers. Now, we do gift out a lot of meat to our kids who are out of the home, but they're small family sizes too, if not just even themselves eating, and they only go through so much at a time. And so I opted to hardly put anything up in the freezer. I have my tomatoes coming out of the garden. I'm gonna have those in the freezers, but I will have it canned before my meat comes. So I'm not worried about that. But long-term produce, like my squash and green beans and eggplant, I'm opting to preserve it differently this year. And so I'm gonna bring you along and show you what I'm going to do, and we'll kind of talk about that preservation method and why I choose it over another. Okay. I have my freeze dryer pans over here washed and ready to go for another batch. I'm adding some parchment paper to this one because I purchased these silicone mats and somehow one mysteriously disappeared. So I just used parchment on that one. I have way too many squash. This is patty pan squash. If you want to feel like an official professional gardener, I suggest you grow patty pan. You'll get way more than you need. You'll be sick of it by August. This weekend I'm actually going to be cleaning out some of the garden beds over there in my garden, and these are coming out because I can't even give them away anymore. People are just like, you're tired of squash, we're tired of squash, and I have so much of it to preserve. I'm not going to grow these next year. There was a little bit of a mishap in my garden. Things weren't labeled and I didn't know what I was putting into the ground. I had started all my starts in my greenhouse and I just knew I can identify a squash plant versus a cucumber versus, tomato, pepper type of thing, but I didn't know exactly, just when it was a little seedling, I didn't know exactly what kind of squash I was throwing into the ground. And unfortunately, I have probably, I think 7 plants. I have yellow and white. You really only need 1 plant, and I was hoping some of them would be a pumpkin variety because I was growing a ton of new squash and pumpkin varieties this year, and so I took my chances. That's what I was left with. A good plethora, I would say, of options, but just way too many of these. So I had already took the liberty of preparing a ton for my freeze dryer. So freeze dryers, part of the process of what it does is it first freezes your food. Now, you do not have to freeze anything that's going into the freeze dryer first, at least nothing that so far I've come across. It does, however, help the freeze dryer because it doesn't then have to run as long. It is based off of, it has a temperature gauge in there. And so if frozen food is going in, it's not going to take as long for your machine to identify that it's frozen. Plus it helps, like I said, I'm going to be rotating through all of these, and so the best way to get the food preserved in time without it starting to rot and go to waste is kind of prepping ahead and just getting them ready into the freezer. And then this way, once my freeze dryer is empty, I can roll out another batch, no problem. You do not, however, with freeze dryers, you don't want to mix frozen and room temperature items. So if I didn't have enough squash or whatever it was that I was freezing at the time, if I didn't have enough to fill my freeze dryer, I'd have to look in my freezer to find something else, or just run a half a batch, I suppose. But you can't, if I only had 2 trays of frozen, I can't chop this up and put them into my freeze dryer. I've never done it. I can't really tell you necessarily what exactly would happen, but I imagine your food would just come out uneven. Your freeze dryer wouldn't know. Non-frozen food probably wouldn't be as frozen as your frozen, as the frozen food. So just best practice, don't do that. So I'm gonna get these all laid out here. I'm hardly going to put a dent into what's on this tray, but I'm gonna do my best. So I sliced up real thin because I think what I'm gonna do is I'm going to powder this. Squash can be treated as any type of squash at some point. And so whether it's zucchini or yellow squash, you can use it pretty much universally if you're making a sweetbread from it. And so that's kind of my thought, is it'll take up less space in my pantry as well if I can powder it all and throw it into a jar. Vacuum seal the lid, and it'll be on my pantry for whenever it is I'm ready for it. So that's my game plan. I would love to know what you guys do with your plethora of squash that comes in. I feel like I've pretty much done every method under the sun. I have it sliced, I have it shredded, I have it cubed, I have it frozen, I have it freeze-dried, I have it dehydrated. Oh. But like I said, to make sure we're going through everything that I have put up in my pantry, at some point you have to identify and say, you know what, I think I have enough, and focus on using that space in your garden to grow something different. And that's what I'm going to do next year. Next year, I don't know that I'm even going to do zucchini or yellow squash. As much as I love yellow squash, and it might be a little difficult not having even one plant, but I know what I have put up, I'm not going to go through it quite as quickly for it to make sense to grow any more next year. So I will use that space to plant some new crops that I have never done before, or perhaps I need more of, and I'll have that space available to me. So it looks like all of my thin squash will fit perfectly on my pans. Notice I am not crowding. You want to leave space on your trays so that it has room for it to dry. If it's over top of each other, you're not getting the air circulation that is required, and your food might require more dry time, which uses more electricity. And so something like this, you really want to keep spaced out and not overlapping each other to ensure that they all dry properly. These are going to go into the freeze dryer. Okay, I'm going to get started on the squash, and I'm going to de-seed these. See what the easiest way to do that is. I have a grapefruit spoon, and so it's got the jagged edges on each side, and that makes it really easy. I think what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna leave these in large chunks, but with my freeze dryer, the amount of space in between each rack is actually quite small. So I can't have just big chunks of anything. I imagine that's probably okay too, because it would probably take an awful long time for it to actually process. So I'm just gonna leave them just like this because it will freeze dry just fine. And then I'm just gonna be powdering it, so I don't need it into small little soup size chunks or anything like that. So I'm just gonna get these all de-seeded, chopped up, kind of just moving along here in the kitchen today. I've got a lot of things happening behind me. Got lunch going. I've got some bacon cooking. We're gonna have BLTs for lunch since I do officially have a ton of tomatoes now coming out of the garden. Besides the baby tomatoes, I have good slicer tomatoes, and so I'm going to have my first BLT with homegrown tomatoes for the year. Like I said, this is just gonna go back into my freezer. I do have a few more squash in the garden. I'm hoping I can gift those. I think I'm gonna give a few to my mom, and I think I'm going to also give a few to a friend at work. Her family enjoys squash, and so they will sit in the fridge or on the counter for a week or two before they start to turn. So there's no rush in using it up. It's not quite like a winter squash though, which I do have a ton of butternut squash, and they're just little bitty, which is actually preferable. I have purchased the really huge butternut squashes in the past from my local farmer, and I have had a hard time using those up, even when I had a bigger family size, because not all my family enjoys butternut. So the really tiny ones that I have in my garden this year will be perfect for us to store. I'm not going to preserve any of those right away. I'm going to wait and eat them fresh, of course, but I'll start preserving them once they tell me they're starting to go south a little, and I will probably make new batches of butternut squash soup and can it. I don't necessarily need any freeze-dried. I do know I have quite a bit of it freeze-dried. So I'll probably make soup, give some of those to my mom. And just have it on my pantry shelf. Okay, these are all cut up. They're gonna go into my freezer, waiting their turn. This will go to the chickens or to my compost. And I have one left that I didn't fit on the sheet, and I just decided I will force it upon somebody. On to the next project. In my dehydrator, I have the patty pan squash that I had worked on earlier today, getting into the freezer to then put in my freeze dryer. I have yellow zucchini, and it's very dry, just snaps right apart. I have them just in little moon shapes. Now, I also have baby tomatoes that I put in sliced. These particular tomatoes, I don't remember what kind they are, but they're like, I guess, a grape tomato. I think that's what I was thinking. So these were more like a grape tomato, and these were the yellow and orange variety. And so I sliced these, but I also had the red baby tomatoes that you can see some of them need more time. I punctured a hole right down the stem side and then along the side as well. So some of them have dried very beautifully, just curled up like a raisin. Some are taking a little bit longer, so I'm going to go ahead and remove everything that is dry, and I will let these go for a little longer. I'm going to add something else though into the dehydrator so it's not only running off of the 1/2 tray. This is a jar that I have completed already. It's got patty pan, green zucchini, and yellow zucchini in it. When it comes to preserving squash, I do keep them separated depending on the variety. So that way I know I have either a yellow zucchini, a yellow squash, green zucchini, patty pan. But there's times towards the end of the harvest season where I have plenty preserved, and I will start just putting them into the same jar. I'll use these very particularly anyhow. I can use the other ones, of course, that I have separate, but these I will just put a handful into casseroles, soups, stews, chilies. At the end of the day, I don't mind what type of squash is going into my soup, but there are side dishes where I will rehydrate certain squash, and I may not want a mixture at that point. So, but this I'm just going to keep adding to this jar until it's either full or I am finally running out of squash to preserve. So I'm gonna get these all in here, and I will show you here in a minute what I do with my tomatoes. I dehydrate most of my produce, but specifically we'll discuss my squash here. I dehydrate it at a temperature of 130. I like to go low and slow with a lot of my dehydrating when it comes to produce anyhow, because when you dehydrate, it requires heat. You're drying out that item using heat on it, and if you do too high of a temperature, you generally don't get the end product that you are looking for. It really dries it out, makes it discolored sometimes, and of course any heat that you're adding to a vegetable is going to affect the nutrition at the end of the process. It's cooking, it's not really cooking, I should say, but to me, it's pulling out some of that nutrition, because anytime you heat something, it's changing the protein of that vegetable or fruit. And I just don't know that you'll like the outcome when it's all said and done. So don't be afraid to go low and slow. If you are unsure what temperature you should be dehydrating anything at, there are lovely books out there that can tell you what temperature is best for the item that you are dehydrating. High sugar content type of fruits might require a different heat temperature than maybe, say, your squash. Certainly tomatoes as well. So get these all filled up. Now the thing I do love about dehydrating is you can get a lot into a tiny space. So I have all of that just here, and I still have room in this jar to keep adding to it. Whereas when you freeze dry, it generally stays the size that you put the product in as, and there are some things that actually expand a little bit. But I'm gonna go grab the jar of the yellow zucchini that I have that I freeze dried. So visually, I will say it's no contest which one looks better versus dehydrating or freeze drying. But if space is an issue for you, then I definitely recommend dehydrating. But you can see the freeze dried product really turns out quite nicely, but it requires a lot more space. So basically, there we go. It definitely does not get smaller. I mean, it may have shrunk up just a smidge, but basically the size of this that I put in is the size that is coming out. And so you'll just have to be mindful of that. I'm going to set this aside. I do vacuum seal the jars when I put pretty much anything in there. I just feel like it really helps to maintain the freshness a lot longer. So I'm gonna leave that out so I can vacuum seal it. Now, with my tomatoes, there's a few things you can do with dehydrated tomatoes. You can certainly throw this in a jar, just the same as we did our squash, and, you know, go back to it whenever you're ready to use it. These again are good in soups, chilies, casseroles. You can blend it up to make a tomato powder. What I like to do once they're dehydrated, and I don't do this with all of them, I do like to keep them, I like to do it in many different forms, but with these ones, because I don't have any currently, I'm going to pack these in olive oil. I'm going to get a nice, clean, sterilized jar, and I'm going to add a little olive oil at the bottom. I'm going to put these in, top it off with more olive oil, and I want to make sure that these are always covered by a layer just below that olive oil. And these will start to plump up a little bit more once they're in the olive oil, of course, but they'll basically stay the consistency that they're in. And then these are wonderful to use over the top of pizzas, because they're not going to stay super crisp, but they're going to be more pliable once you take them out of the olive oil. If you'd like, you could store it in the fridge as well, but of course, true olive oil will start to harden once it gets cold. It doesn't affect anything, it just doesn't make it as user-friendly unless you're thinking ahead of time and pulling that jar out to come to room temp a little bit. So that's what I'm going to do with the ones that are already dried. And the ones that still need more time, I will put back in the dehydrator.